The Great Barrier Reef is doomed because of climate change. Or is it? It's one of those areas where there has been some significant conflict, and it's something that we'd probably like to know what's true and what isn't. Well, let's have a look. There are many people who have seen the beauty of the Great Barrier Reef on the various nature programs on television and said to themselves, I'd love to see that some point in my life. And there are lots of people that would tell them they'd better hurry up because the reef is in imminent danger of disappearance. Like this 2017 article, scientists announced that the Great Barrier Reef is officially terminal. Actually, scientists reviewed that article and pointed out that the largely accurate body of the article didn't justify that headline, which they labelled as misleading. And that immediately flags up one of the common issues we find whenever we're looking into any detail of climate science, which is that the journalists and the headline writers pursue a dramatic clickbait storyline which often obscures the genuine nuance in the actual research. And then you get headlines like this one: Great Barrier Reef may perish by the 2030s. Articles based on the premise that something could happen or may happen is usually a tell for a journalistic focus on a worst case scenario. And indeed, scientists reviewed this article and said that although it was accurate, as would have been its opposite, Great Barrier Reef may not perish by 2030s, both versions are true, they pointed out that it was exaggerated. Coral reefs may well perish by the 2030s, but the Great Barrier Reef is an ecosystem of many different species that are variously resistant to change. So while there may be trouble ahead, it doesn't mean we necessarily expect the entire Great Barrier Reef to be devastated. Let's step back for a moment and consider the astounding beauty and wonder of what we're discussing. The Great Barrier Reef is home to 3,000 varieties of mollusks. I bet you didn't realise there were so many, let alone all in one place. 1,625 species of fish, hundreds of sharks and rays, over 100 types of jellyfish, and over 30 kinds of whales and dolphins. It's home to 3,000 individual coral reefs stretching across 1,600 miles, which is more than 2.5 times the length of the UK, from Land's End to John O'Groats. It covers an area of about 133,000 square miles. It's surely a bland understatement to suggest that it's one of the natural wonders of the world. And some would say it's also one of nature's canaries in the coal mine, the delicate environment that gives the earliest indication of damage being wrought by climate change. And this is importantly seen in mass bleaching events. What is bleaching? Well, you need to understand what the coral actually is and how it survives. The coral's made up of thousands or even millions of individual animals called polyps, just a few centimetres across. The polyps make the calcium carbonate structure of the coral, and those polyps are fed by algae that live symbiotically, where two organisations live together acting as one inside the polyp. The algae make energy from sunlight. The polyp takes a share of that energy in return for providing a sheltered living environment. But if the water gets hotter than normal, the system breaks down and the algae becomes poisonous to the polyp. So the polyp expels its symbionts, and because it's the algae that gives the polyp its colour, it turns white, hence the bleaching effect. Without its symbiotic partner, the polyp will soon run out of energy. Within weeks or months, it will die if it doesn't take on more symbionts that are floating in the water. A light bleaching event will see the vast majority of the corals regaining their colour and recovering within months as they take on new symbionts, but a mass bleaching event can be more damaging. One paper observed that reefs that saw more than 25% bleaching would see long-term loss of coral cover. Below that threshold, generally no loss of cover after 8 months or so. There have been 5 major bleaching events in the last 25 years. In 1998, 2002, a particularly bad one in 2016, and another in 2017, and then the final one, the third in just 5 years, this year in 2020. According to scientists reviewing the damage, around a quarter of the reefs were severely affected, meaning that more than 60% of the corals in those reefs were bleached. Generally, it can take more than a decade for the reef to recover from a bleaching event, and significantly longer for a really serious one. So with 3 events in just 5 years, and with temperatures in the waters local to the reef expected to rise by another 1 degree Celsius in the coming years with global warming, you can easily understand why many fear that this is looking pretty grim. But this is where the debate kicks in. Peter Ridd, a physicist, disputes the established narrative around the imminent doom of the reef. First, he points out that many of the species of coral that live on the Great Barrier Reef also live in much warmer waters, close to the equator around Indonesia and Thailand. Indeed, in those warmer waters, the coral grows faster and more prolifically, so it's maybe possible for those species to respond to warmer water in a positive fashion. He also makes the case that coral reefs have survived for an immensely long stretch of history. This is an indicator of how extraordinarily resilient they are in the face of change, because they would never have lived so long had they been that fragile. He says that corals can select for species of symbionts that give them the ability to adapt to the prevailing conditions. Some species will enable them to grow quicker but may be more susceptible to bleaching. Others will give slower growth rates but may make them more resilient to high temperatures. His point is supported by, for instance, this paper by Baker 2003, which says this: the persistence of bleaching-resistant symbiont types in affected ecosystems and the possibility of recombination among different partners following bleaching may lead to significant shifts in symbiont community structure and elevations of future bleaching thresholds. Monitoring symbiont communities worldwide is essential to understanding the long-term response of reefs to the global climate change, because it will help resolve current controversy over the timescales over which symbiont change might occur. Peter Ridd describes this system as a masterpiece of adaptability. In the event of a severe bleaching where much of a colony dies, those polyps with a strain of symbiont that mitigate against bleaching are able to regrow over the dead coral in the following years. He quotes this paper, Roth et al. 2014, which labelled the rapid regeneration of large Peritas corals after the 1997 bleaching event as the Phoenix effect. All that is an interesting indicator that the reefs could perhaps turn out to be more resilient. None of it actually lines up as a proof that it will, sufficient to justify his remarkably uncompromising optimism on the subject. For instance, he says this: corals are perhaps the least endangered of any ecosystem to future climate change. Nevertheless, it's an interesting challenge. He supports it with a contention that not only will the reefs come through the recent incidents of bleaching, but the reefs have frequently seen such incidents back through history. Now, a number of scientists suggest that the mass bleaching has been a unique indicator of the onset of climate change. And he quotes one particular scientist who he suggests has not been a high-quality participant, Professor Terry Hughes, who made the following statement on ABC Radio.
A critical issue here is that these bleaching events are novel. When I was a PhD student 30 years ago, regional scale bleaching events were completely unheard of. They're a human invention due to global warming, and they really represent a policy failure by Australia and other countries for not tackling rising temperatures.
In fact, says Ridd, there have been 26 records of coral bleaching before 1982, and he points out that we simply don't know what may have happened in the past. If a mass bleaching event had occurred on the Great Barrier Reef in the 1930s, who would have noticed? It is possible that a few pearl or bêche de mer divers might have, but they would have been unlikely to report their findings to scientists or the world's media. Contrast that to today, when a bleaching event will be documented by hundreds of scientists who may have been waiting and preparing for the event for years. Now, it's a fair question to ask. And if I've criticised Ridd for his apparent absolute certainty on the reef's resiliency in the future, I am only being consistent if I similarly record a criticism against Hughes for suggesting that mass bleaching must be a novel event, which it still might be. There's a distinction that people don't always make between a regional scale event, which is what he described in that radio interview, and the historical mentions of bleaching, none of which we know to have been at that sort of scale. Obviously, bleaching as a mechanism wasn't invented purely as a response to global warming. It's presumably been a feature of how corals have behaved for millennia. But whether or not there have been mass bleaching events which the reefs have then happily recovered from, that's an important question. One paper claimed to answer the question, this one, reconstructing 4 centuries of temperature-induced coral bleaching on the Great Barrier Reef. The paper looked at the large corals whose growth bands similar to tree rings could give some clues to bleaching events in the past, and it sought to relate those records to the historical temperature records to see what might correlate to known periods of exceptional warmth in the past. Having reviewed a period over 381 years from 1620 onwards, it showed increasing incidence of bleaching years between 1620 and 1753, declining incidence until 1820, and then increasing again from 1821 to the current day. Even then, it sounded a cautious note in relation to the future. But reconstructed increases in bleaching frequency and prevalence may suggest coral populations are reaching an upper bleaching threshold, a tipping point beyond which coral survival is uncertain. So even according to this paper, the past circumstances don't replicate the expected future ones. And that said, even what the paper does put forward was ripped apart by some of the mainstream scientists working in this area. It was described by one, Mark Eakin of NOAA, as some of the worst science to be published in a reputable journal in many years. A rebuttal paper was produced that took issue with how the authors had used various proxy records that simply didn't give sufficient reliable temperature data for what they were attempting to prove. And this paper was supported by some of the original authors of those data sets. It also took issue with their approach to detecting bleaching events in the first place, arguing that the phenomena they were observing could have been caused by a number of different causes, not necessarily only by a mass bleaching. And it concluded with this: many of us have reviewed this paper repeatedly over the last 5 years, over 14 instances that we know of. The lack of response to reviewers' concerns, repeated submission to other journals without change, and highly questionable use of data sets that many of us have developed is extremely regrettable and misleading. None of which proves that mass bleaching events have never happened, nor indeed that they have happened. There was at least one other paper that looked back into China's prehistory and decided there was a mass bleaching in the northern South China Sea. But the simple truth is, given the paucity of granular evidence, the past is not easily going to tell us if there have been equivalent events that we can learn from, where a sustained increase resulted in multiple bleachings and waters then continued to get warmer after those, not just one-off events that went quickly back to normal. Will coral quickly adapt to the increases? Will they adjust their tolerance threshold, or will they just begin to die off? You can be optimistic or pessimistic, but on the current evidence, what nobody should be doing is speaking with self-assured certainty, one way or the other. The fact that similar species of corals are capable of doing well in warmer waters is suggestive, but by no means proof that they can survive rapid change, which may be more the issue than the actual temperature. The IPCC sounds this note of uncertainty. It has not yet been established whether coral may hold beyond 1.5 degrees Celsius warming. The onset of coral bleaching in the last decade has occurred at higher SSTs, which is sea surface temperatures, than in the previous decade, suggesting that coral populations that remain after preceding bleaching events may have a higher thermal threshold, potentially as a result of the increased dominance of species with lower sensitivity or higher adaptive capacity. So regardless of the sensationalist headlines, the official line is uncertainty. This is clearly a system under stress, or absolutely nobody denies that. Is this the stress that creates rapid adaptation and change, such as when you stress a muscle to make it stronger? That would fit with the long-lived nature of the reefs and RID's contention that they're therefore highly resilient. Or is it the stress that pre-shadows a total collapse? There are examples of that aplenty in the natural world as well. We don't know. there have been some hopeful signs. For instance, in May this year, research was published showing how some coral reefs are adapting to warming ocean temperatures by making bright neon colours that attracts coral algae to return to them quicker. Dr. Mike Emsley, leader of the long-term monitoring programme for the Australian Institute of Marine Science, says this: "Our surveys along the length and breadth of the Great Barrier Reef tell us that the reef is resilient, but this resilience has limits. The slight increases in coral cover across much of the Great Barrier Reef this past year are encouraging, but the full effect of the mass bleaching on coral mortality will not be known for several months." Now, Peter Ridd also argues that the research relating to the impact on coral reefs of ocean acidification is similarly flawed. And he argues that there needs to be an increased degree of critical scrutiny, particularly of science that feeds into public policy. He argues that the quality of the research on the reef is leading erroneously to a great deal of public money being spent unnecessarily. At one point, he made that case rather uncompromisingly on Sky News, where he said, "We can no longer trust the scientific organisations like the Australian Institute of Marine Science and even things like the ARC Centre of Excellence for Coral Reef Studies." His university, James Cook, reviewed his comments and terminated his employment on the grounds that such uncollegial comments were against the university's code of conduct. Now, Ridd then took the university to court and he recently won that case. I've not gone into any of the detail of that case in this video. I've said here before that I don't support people getting fired from academic posts because of their beliefs or their statements, but there's a lot of detail in all that, enough for a separate video of its own. And this video is about the science behind the Great Barrier Reef, not about the politics. I will just say this: I do think there's a good case to be made for an institutionalised mechanism of scientific challenge to any body of science that will have a significant public policy implication. Some of the smartest innovative agencies have utilised so-called red teams to avoid groupthink and complacency by having a robust internal challenge process. Some argue it's not necessary because the peer review process and various institutes that produce a regular review of the state of the science, and they already create that sort of challenge. But I think it's valid to say if it's an issue that's in the public interest, then a public funded layer that is separate to the scientific establishment wouldn't necessarily be a bad idea. Whether it would lead us to demonstrably different conclusions in this case right now seems pretty unlikely. It might rein in those scientists inclined to speak in more apocalyptic and uncompromising terms. I doubt it would give licence to the critics, who would make the case that there's nothing to see here, the reef is in the finest possible health you could hope for. In the meantime, the cut and thrust is going to continue. Here's the BBC in October this year. Great Barrier Reef has lost half of its corals since 1995. This headline was based on a published study by Professor Hughes again. Peter Ridd attacked the story, pointing out that the best data on coral cover is taken by the Australian Institute of Marine Science, which is nice of him given that he lost his job for slagging them off. Their data shows that coral cover fluctuates dramatically with time, but there is roughly the same amount of coral today as 1995. One could argue that the 50% reduction would fit one of the three reef areas on their data, but certainly not the others. Ridd goes on to claim Professor Hughes, who has been making the headlines, has previously stated that coral cover halved between the 1960s and 2000. This work was strongly criticised by the AIMS scientists responsible for the data shown in the figure. Professor Hughes has not made public the raw data upon which he made that previous claim, despite repeated requests. I haven't been able to verify those claims. I assume there's some scope for distinction between coral cover and the total amount of living coral. Certainly the headline doesn't seem compatible with the message from the AIMS latest report that I just previously quoted. And that fact alone probably adds weight to the call for an independent process. So that's one conclusion. Peter Ridd may be wrong to project the certainty that he does, but he provides a useful challenge. Other conclusions. There are grounds to be concerned, but also reasons to be hopeful. We have to watch what happens through the coming years, which will certainly give us more signs of a system under stress. And in the meantime, we should be wary of headlines that look like they were written to big up a worst case scenario. There's a huge amount of detail behind this area. I haven't been able to cover a fraction of it. Hopefully I got the essence. So what's your take on what you've heard? Let me know in the comments below.